simply read a list of publications and awards, which is, of course, meaningless. You rose above that, and I thank you. And greetings to everybody on Zoom or in person from me in New Haven, where it's at the end of a very long day of teaching. So if my voice sounds a bit shaky, it's because I've been talking since early this morning. But bear with me. I'd rather, of course, be with you in person in Hangzhou, and I look forward to a time when we can all meet face to face. Because what I'm about to share with you, the almost 20 years of the Yale School of Architecture China studio was all about face to face and person to person contact, which, as I'm sure you know, is essential to our shared education mission. So, without further ado, I'll present a brief, hopefully brief, overview of our experience, and then we can get into some discussion. The whole idea of the Yale China studio was hashed between these three friends in 1998. Actually, my friend Leslie Liu, who is on the right, got in touch with me in his capacity as chair of architecture at Hong Kong University and asked if Yale would ever consider doing a joint studio with Hong Kong. And he proposed at that time that we make it a three-way collaboration between Hong Kong U, Yale, and Tongji University in Shanghai. I had not previously been to Shanghai. So in 1998, Leslie and I flew to Shanghai and met with Wang Bo-wei, who is the gentleman on the left and was then dean of the College of Architecture at Tongji. And we agreed that we would try a few years of a three-way joint studio. Well, it was all to the advantage of me and my students, because as you know, in the late 90s and early 2000s, these two cities, Hong Kong and Shanghai, were among the most dynamic and interesting places in the world, especially for architects and people who think about and also are excited about cities, rapidly changing, of course, so that as I proceeded to participate in this collaboration, I would be in Hong Kong and Shanghai 2 or 3 times a year. And every time I went back, it seems like those cities had totally transformed. Of course, their spectacular geographic setting, which is a big part of the story, remained constant. But what was being built was almost unbelievable at the time, as these two cities took their place on the world stage. And of course, that had also its liabilities and problems. Shanghai and Hong Kong as well were becoming part of a recognizably globalized architecture that looked surprisingly the same from London to Tokyo to New York, of course, and Los Angeles, Taipei, and back again. And this arresting image appeared at the time in the London Financial Times and emphasized the coalescence of the sense of place and identity between all of these cities. At the same time, Shanghai in 2000 was certainly still recognizably its own place. And I show you this aerial image of a view of central Shanghai transforming apparently before our eyes. And that transformation, as you know, eventually tipped the balance between new globalized construction and design and the old DNA, the genetic code of so much of early 20th century Shanghai, and represented by the distinctive housing typology of the Lilong, which by 2000 was already being self-consciously consumed and represented in the hottest new project, which was not, in fact, a skyscraper, but rather the reconstruction of a fragment of a historic neighborhood, now rebranded as Xintiandi by a Hong Kong developer using the design services of an American architect. And this was really our jumping off point for the joint studio. In that first year, a much younger version of me explored the lane and boulevards of this incredible city with my students, one of whom you see here sketching in a Long neighborhood just off of Nanjing Road. And immediately when we appeared anywhere, and especially when we took out our cameras and sketchbooks, we became the focus of local interest, which of course was all good. So that initial studio, we collectively determined would be focused on one of these rapidly transforming areas, the Suzhou Creek, which runs through Shanghai, as you know, and was formerly a major industrial area. Well, the old factories, those that were left, were at that time being transformed into upscale commercial spaces and art galleries as part of a second generation movement in Shanghai urban planning, spearheaded by a professor at Tongji, Wu Zhang, whom pioneered this concept of using arts and culture to anchor new adaptive retrofit based development. At the same time, as you can see, these towers were surrounding these areas in a constant warfare for the precious development sites. So we took on one of these sites in a bend of the Suzhou Creek, as you can see, as our first collaborative studio. And I show you two of our student projects, one of which simply seeks to reinstate the scale of the older residential fabric, and another of which tries to blend that scale with a medium scale of new modern development. And this would be a theme throughout our studios, the constant dialectic or tension between the desire to preserve or carry forward a more traditional urban scale of fabric and an attempt to also embrace what was new and exciting about recent development. In the next year of the studio, also along the Studio Creek near its mouth, where it runs into the Wangpu River, we chose a highly visible site next to the old post office, where Hong Kong University would later establish its studies center in Shanghai. And you can see that at least one of our students took the opportunity of this high visibility site to propose something much more avant-garde. Well, in the next year, we tried a brief experiment. We said to ourselves, maybe the Tongji students, instead of hosting us in their city, would like to visit Hong Kong. And so we found a very prominent site right at the tip of the Kowloon Peninsula in Hong Kong's modern museum district and arts district, and proposed interventions on that site. All this time, our students were traveling to China, first to Hong Kong and then on to Shanghai in early October, usually. And then the Chinese students from both Hong Kong and Tongji would come to Yale for final reviews in December. And in between, we would have video conferences. Believe it or not, there was no Zoom in those days. So the technology was even more difficult, but we managed to keep our exchange going. The next year, we were back in Shanghai, just past the mouth of the Suzhou Creek, as you can see here, in the so-called North Bund neighborhood, where the old cruise terminal was, proposing large-scale urban development. And you can see two of our students' projects for this site. 2003 looked like this. Why? Because as some of us are old enough to remember, that was the year of SARS. So we were, for not the last time, obviously, unable to travel to China. But we picked up again in 2004, this time on a site that you can see represented on maps behind the students, which was to be, of course, the site of the 2010 Expo in Shanghai. And we asked our students to look at an old shipyard area that was right on the doorstep of the expo site. And you see Yale and Hong Kong and Tongji students meeting on the campus of Tongji during our visit. And on the left, you see one of our student projects developed by Fourth Bagley, who would go on to head the Shanghai office of Kohn Pedersen Fox, KPF, and spend over half his time in China. He's since come back to New York as one of the senior partners in KPF, but still doing a lot of work in Asia. So already you can see the influence on the subsequent careers of our students. And of course, on the Chinese side, many of the students we had met in Hong Kong and at Tongji were showing up in our post-professional master's program even already. So 2005 found us back along the heart of the Suja Creek on a very historic site. And this is one of the extraordinary student projects. I still have the model of this project in my office right outside my door currently. So impressive it was, as an example, a mixed use, mixed scale urban development. In 2006, we moved back to the east, almost to the Bund, and reshaped part of the iconic waterfront of the Bund itself. And already here, you can perhaps see that water itself is becoming a serious issue as the students are thinking about rising sea level and coastal adaptation. along with a more conventional urban development. Well, the next year, we chose a typical Leelong site just off Waihalu. Um, that was, as we toured it, already being demolished. And it turned out that Wombo Wei's mother had lived there, and he was almost in tears to see his childhood neighborhood being torn down. So again, our students tried to balance adaptive conservation of some of the historic buildings with new low-rise fabric, but also on the main streets with a scale of development that really suited what the real estate market in Shanghai was doing at that time. And as you can see, we also emphasize in our studios not only urban planning, but detailed studies through models and drawings of actual building design. The next year, 2008, we took a site on Nanjing Road itself that has since become, through the design of another former student of mine at KPF, the Kerry Center, which if you've been to Shanghai, you probably know. It's right next to the Soviet era exhibition center. And there our students explored, again, a blending of scales and relative porosity of one of these gigantic urban super blocks, which were to prove for urban development such a challenge. The next year, we moved north along the Wangpu River to a site which has now been totally redeveloped next to the historic British waterworks, which supplied water for Shanghai for so many years. For midterm, teams of students developed a master plan, and then after midterm, they proceeded to develop an individual section of that master plan in much more detail. And finally, in 2010, we took a very difficult urban site right on the main road to the Tongji campus from the historic center around the Bund, which although it was bounded by lots of modern infrastructure, was not very well connected. And this student took on the job of reconnecting this site using those very infrastructural connections as the basis of both his urban design and his building design, moving from a diagram to a plan to a gigantic wooden model of the whole area and studies of the experience on site. Well, this proved to be, for a variety of reasons, the end of our three-way collaboration with Tongji. For a number of years, colleagues from Tsinghua had been urging us to devote a joint studio to Beijing and new collaboration with Tsinghua. And so in 2011, we signed a 3-year agreement with Tsinghua, and our principal collaborator was their dean, Xu Wenyi, which who you see here having a deep conversation with a camel at the Ming tombs right outside of Beijing. And of course, as you know, Beijing is a completely different kind of urban landscape, traditionally planned according to the centuries old principles of imperial city planning. And also, unlike Shanghai in the Yangtze Delta, which is absolutely flat, always engaged visually and cosmologically with the larger landscape. So this was a change. Of course, Beijing at the time had just completed or was completing its own set of iconic modern buildings designed by global architects like Herzog and Yumuran and OMA. So our students toured these, but also saw that even these new buildings were in effect plugged back in to the traditional axial structure, which still to this day organizes the growing city, the exploding city, really, along with newer ring roads, and relates outward to the larger landscape. Of course, Beijing had just completed its a very successful hosting of the Olympic Games. And so we decided a rather bold pedagogical move to identify 3 sites along this historic but extending north-south axis. And as you can see, in our first year, we worked on the area right next to the Forbidden City itself, moving the next year north to an Olympic site, and then south along the axis towards what was then already projected as the new corridor of growth towards Beijing's second airport to a southern side. And I'll show you those quickly. In 2011, as you can see, and as I said, we worked in the historic neighborhood, literally right next to the moat of the Forbidden City. And this group of Yale students did an extraordinary project. They first went out and met local residents and gathered their thoughts and perceptions, as you can see. And then based on that, they proposed a project that they called slow tourism, in reaction to the usual tourist experience of being dropped off on a tour bus in front of Tiananmen, and then rapidly charging along the main axis of the Forbidden City to be picked up by the same tour bus at the northern gate. Instead, they proposed a much more immersive experience of exploring and getting to know, as they had, the older neighborhood right next to the Forbidden City, which tourists almost never saw, and a very light scale of intervention. The next year's site was very different. It was a big open site left over by the Olympic Games. And you can see what our students did was to master plan these 2 gigantic super blocks, and then take their own section of it and explore it right down to the level of urban fabric and public buildings. And then moving south further to the area next to the then brand new Southern Railway station of Beijing, where all the high-speed trains arrive. You can see an even bolder approach taken to developing a new mixed-use district in this particular area. Going into our fourth year, having explored the full length of the north-south axis, we took a break and turned to the old port city of Beijing, Tianjin, and on the site of one of China's biggest shipbuilding yards, our students explored a new waterfront development of, on the one hand, a mixed-use neighborhood, on the left, or a new innovation campus on the right, both of which reuse a lot of the older buildings, spectacular industrial buildings and equipment left over from the shipyard. A very successful studio. And I'm almost done, but I'll show you our final two studios with Tsinghua, both of which I consider to be among the most interesting and successful studios I've ever led. In 2015, we had intended to return to a site in Tianjin. But you may remember in August of that year, just before we were due to travel there was a huge explosion in the waterfront area of Tianjin. And of course, we couldn't go. And at the very last minute, we found a neglected site along the river, just behind the Beijing main train station. And there we asked our students to consider what uses they might develop. This team of two students, two extraordinary students, proposed a literally spectacular mixed-use development, for which they drew by hand a whole series of these poster reviews conveying the excitement of this new urban site. They even published a graphic novel depicting and describing what they were proposing. Another team of students actually took this opportunity to do a comprehensive bicycle plan, a new bicycle plan for all of Beijing. based and centered at the site that we have given them, but extending far beyond that to several really amazing projects, I think, that hopefully convey the enthusiasm and the excitement our students felt for the Beijing and Chinese urban landscape. The final studio I propose we do right in Chinghua's backyard in the YUDW area, which if any of you have visited or attended Tsinghua, you surely know it is the intense commercial area right in front of Tsinghua main campus. And one of our groups of 3 students really sunk their teeth into this challenge and developed incredible graphics. This scroll drawing across the bottom of my slide is probably 40 feet long. And I show you a photograph of the 3 students working late at night collaboratively on that drawing. But they also did amazing roof-off views inspired by the Tsinghua graduates who call themselves drawing architecture, whose work you may know. So they removed the roofs of their new urban fabric, exposing the activities. But they didn't stop there. Excuse me. I'm almost done, and my voice is almost done as well. They didn't stop there. They made no less than 3 videos which presented their project. And I'm gonna show you a bit of one of them if I can get it to run. So here's a panorama of their scroll, and then they zoomed in, and I'll let their story tell itself.
I'm the watchman. I operate the gates safe. My job is rails go to the ground. I get to lunch each day at the use. I walk by so many people. My best friend is P1. He works here in Korea, but he dreams us down and so let's go. Who knows? Maybe we'll partner up. It was my job. Then both go on. Juwon and I didn't started a Korean taco truck. Our idea is to make a job. says Jacob. This is great, but the sun is brittle. Where do we sit? We make a place with trees, says Jacob. This is great, but difficult. What about the night market? What about more permanent space? With our money, we build cheap structures to shelter immigrants. There was once a night market here, and now it's back. Not everyone is happy. At least all the city officials. We learned about YUDW, the Urban Initiatives Institute. He turned out to be a rabble. He had his way. Thank you for
Okay, that's probably enough. It goes on and gets even more interesting, but I need to conclude and turn to you for some questions. But I will leave you with 3 lessons I've learned about doing these kinds of international joint studios. One is have the students collaborate. Working together is not just productive, but very valuable in so many ways. And Yale University has an over 100-year history in China, fostering person-to-person relationships. So collaborate. It's an important part of this experience. Secondly, travel. Don't just shut yourself in a studio at a school, but get out together and see new things, like our trips to the water towns outside of Shanghai every year. It's an opportunity for more collective learning, but also for sociability. So my third lesson is eat and drink together. It's so much the heart of our 2 cultures. Certainly in China, food is the medium where people meet, argue, discuss ideas, and form friendships. So with that, I'll turn it back to Gary.
First of all, thank you, Alan, for taking the time to give us this talk, especially after such a long day of teaching. I guess I'll lead off on the questions. I have just a couple of observations. First is that this was a real treat for me also, because I never had the opportunity to really look at the entire 20-year plus history of the studio. During my time at Yale, I was on the review of the last Tsinghua studio, but that was really the last project of the series, and there's such a long history of engagement that I think immediately, for me, I think it deserves its own full treatment, right? A book or exhibition or some kind of more fundamentally substantial.
I agree.
Yeah, it must be one of the most substantial, China studios from any university anywhere else in the world. So I guess I don't want to take all the time, but one question is whether you could talk about how the students, how they benefited the most from coming and observing the development of China over the last 20 years, which has seen incredible changes, and also what the students on the Chinese side, benefited from in engaging with us, because in the last studio, it was actually Tsinghua University bringing students to Yale, right? Zhu Wenyi and students and the models and the drawings all came, and we had a review in the Rudolph Hall. So it wasn't just a one-sided exchange.
For sure. And I think, there are so many dimensions to this. On the architectural and urban side, of course, China in the 90s became a real laboratory in probably the way Japan had been earlier. So international firms were having the opportunity to test ideas that they maybe couldn't build, at least not then, in New York or London. And so ideas were certainly flowing into China, but then they came back to the West, along with many talented students and architects. This was a period of real excitement. And our students, I can count at least a dozen students who graduated from Yale from our program and immediately moved to China, to Hong Kong or Shanghai, and some of them are still there running their own offices, or they come back and still do projects in Asia, based in the US, but the relationships and exchange of ideas were very fluid at that time. And for myself, I watched and to some extent participated in a huge sea change in the way younger architects from China thought about their work. And I recently spoke at the opening of the first show at the RIBA in London, devoted to a young Chinese practice. Our friend who I know you know, Shahong, and her husband were the subject of that show. And on reflecting on their practice, it now represents the maturity of a whole different way of thinking about cities in an Asian context.
Mhm. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that both the reflection of the new generation coming up and also the influence that your studio had on directly had on the Chinese context is really yeah, like I mentioned, I think deserving of its own deeper dive. I think
Yeah.
with respect for your time, we'll limit the questions to one or two from the audience. How does that sound?
Fine.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. How about a couple of questions? Anybody? One or two questions? They're a little bit shy.
I see one of those students out there lurking, Boo Bing, who I know to be at Syracuse these days.
Yep.
Bing, are you there?
Yeah, how about a question?
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Alan. It's, yeah, it's great to see you in this Zoom lecture. I can't believe it's 23 years. I still remember the time you announced about the program when I was there first year.
Right.
Yeah.
We're both older. Are you in Syracuse?
Yeah, I'm now in Syracuse.
Yeah, I heard from Andre that he saw you in New York.
Yeah, on a ferry.
We're gonna be doing a studio with your colleague, Ted Brown, next semester.
Wow.
Fantastic. Anyone else have a question? You guys can use Chinese. I'll translate it. Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
How the children use a lot of elements to express architecture. I want to ask you how to learn the Chinese traditional elements. Because we look a lot of graphic for different period of the studio. I saw some children use the graphic like the tower or some Chinese group to show the Chinese elements. So I want to ask her how students choose the symbolic to express the Chinese style.
So she's a little far away, so I'll transcribe it.
Yeah, I heard part of that, Gary, but relay it.
Sure. So Huayanzi asked how the students dealt with or handled or tried to incorporate sort of Chinese elements in their designs, because in some of the images, we saw these little like sort of pagodas or rivers or some other what you would consider to be traditionally Chinese elements, and how does that go into their thinking?
Yeah, well, the approach that I've always used is grounded in urban morphology and typology. And for example, we spend a lot of time on our trips taking students not only to the famous sites, but walking with them through ordinary neighborhoods like the Lilong in Shanghai or the Hutong in Beijing, but also exploring garden planting as well. But we're not very prescriptive at Yale about what the students choose to do in their own projects. So you can see that the work in any year runs the gamut from more literal engagement with traditional vocabulary of Chinese building, sometimes in a playful or imagistic, even ironic mode, to more engagement with urban fabric and its issues, to very radical interventions in some cases, which are not at all referential, except at a very abstract conceptual level. So it's not something we insist on, but most of them discover some aspect of urban form or urban life that gets them excited. And we encourage them to run with that.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you very much for that. Does anyone else have a question? Either online or here.
Gary, can I add something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think Alan just mentioned about that. I was about to say, at Yale, I think it's more a general, like the culture of education at Yale, that students have a lot of freedom about explore what they're interested in. Also, the methods they try in a studio could vary a lot. It's very different from some other schools. Also, in particular, Alan's studio, he would not impose a very strict way of making drawings or about the format of like you have to represent the city this way. I think that's exactly the power of this China studio. It seems to be a very specific topic, but actually we had a lot of freedom to think about what cities are and how to discuss about these things. I think that's extremely valuable in this.
Yeah, thank you, Bing. You put it very well. Because as you can see, in the best of projects, the students invent whole new ways of looking at the city. And I think some of the work is really original and important. Not all of it. You have to take the failures along with the successes. But if you try something new based on what you have seen yourself, it's gonna mean more to you and to me than just copying something we've already seen.
Yeah. Yeah, and exactly, you have the power to construct the overall intellectual envelope for the studios. So whatever the students could bring in, you can always construct a discussion with them. I think that's also extremely valuable to this learning experience.
I just should note that I had no idea that Bing would be joining tonight. So this is not a setup.
It's great to have this kind of, I guess one thing that's good about Zoom is to be able to have these kind of surprise reunions, right? Anyone that received the news could join in. So this is great.
Good.
Okay. Anyone else? Last chance.
Yeah. Can you see me? I have a question.
Go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me, Alan? Yeah. Okay. I'm a second year student from Zhejiang University, and I have a question. Thank you for Alan for your presentation about the marvelous 20 years collaboration in China and the marvelous works I interested. So as a freshman in landscape architecture, I want to know when the new students come to the studio, how they react to the problem they investigate and how they collaborate with each other. And I just see the marvelous drawings here and the different projects they conducted, but I don't know what's a common problem they faced in the process and how they deal with them. So I haven't taken many design experience, so I don't know how they deal with such a problem and how they react to this and they talk with you. So that's my problem as a freshman.
That's a very good question. And there's no real easy answer. Collaboration, whether it's in school or in the real world, is always a risky business. You don't know ahead of time if it's going to work. But you have to enter into it in a spirit of cooperation and teamwork, and recognize that sometimes one person leads and the next week somebody else might lead. And since you're in landscape architecture, I should say that if I was starting school right now, I would study landscape probably before conventional architecture, or at least after it. I think it's the most dynamic design field right now, and maybe the most important. And more in my collaborations, landscape architects are taking the lead. Not just coming in and planting trees around buildings that architects design, but generating the crucial conceptual structure of large-scale projects. So I'm excited to visit your university and see how landscape is being taught there. I know you live in a very beautiful city in the midst of a very beautiful rural area. And more, that is the source of inspiration for all of us.
Okay,
Great, thank you.
thanks, Alan. So I
Thank you.
also want to know, will we still have the studio in recent years? It
Sorry.
seems that. So I also want to know if we will have the collaboration studios in recent years.
I hope
makes-
so.
Thanks.
Gary and I are working on it.
Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, I mean, for that question, we have been actually we've been talking about doing a studio together in Hangzhou since 2021, I guess, right? But the situation has been difficult for people to travel in both directions. So we'll have to wait a little bit longer, but we hope that as soon as possible that we can maybe do one of these in here, right, at Zhejiang University.
Yeah, I hope so. Since our leaders met yesterday, I'm sure they discussed precisely the collaboration between Yale and Hangzhou.
It was on the agenda. It was on the readout.
Top of the list.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Great. So yeah, thank you again, Alan, for taking your time late in the evening to give us this wonderful lecture. And yeah, we hope to see much more of you in the future. We'll keep this going. So yeah,
Great. Thank you, Gary, and great to see you, Bing.
All right. Thank you again. Okay.